The courtroom was a grand old place, filled with the smell of varnished wood, dust, and the faint echo of authority that hung in the air like smoke. Its walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced men who once held power, their eyes frozen in judgment over generations of people who had passed through. On this particular morning, the benches were filled, every seat occupied by townsfolk eager for drama. A case had drawn unusual attention, a poor farmer accused of theft, facing a sentence that would ruin what was left of his family. The man sat silently, his head bowed, his wrists chained, as the crowd whispered and pointed, trading rumors and pity. But what everyone was really there for wasn't him, it was the little girl standing by his side. Barefoot, dressed in a faded blue dress, patched at the knees, she looked impossibly small against the towering columns of justice. Her eyes, however, burned with something no one could quite name: defiance, desperation, maybe faith itself. The judge, an older man confined to his chair at the front of the room, sat motionless. His face was lined with years of work and pain, but his body no longer obeyed him. He was known as a fair man, though harsh when the law demanded it. A stroke had left him paralyzed from the waist down, yet he still presided, wheeled into court each morning as though refusing to surrender to weakness. The gavel, resting beside his cold hands, symbolized both power and helplessness. The trial had dragged on for weeks, and everyone knew the verdict was close. But that day, something unexpected happened. As the prosecutor finished his closing statement, the girl stepped forward without being called. Her voice trembled at first. A whisper carried on the tense air. "Your Honor," she said, and the room fell silent. "Please, free my father." The judge blinked, glancing at the lawyers. It was not her place to speak, yet something in her tone halted any objection. The prosecutor smirked. "Child, this is a court of law, not a marketplace for bargains." But the girl didn't falter. Her small hands clenched at her sides, her chin lifted. "If you free my father," she said, her voice steadier now, "I will heal you." A ripple of laughter broke through the crowd. Even the stenographer looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. The bailiff coughed to hide a grin. The judge's eyebrows drew together as if he hadn't heard her right. "What did you say?" he asked, his deep voice echoing in the chamber. The girl met his gaze, unblinking. "I will heal you," she repeated, louder this time. "You can walk again, if you let my father go." The laughter grew. Someone at the back muttered, "She's mad," and another snorted, "Maybe she's got magic beans too." The prosecutor leaned against the table, enjoying the spectacle. "Your Honor, this child is clearly confused. We can't indulge this nonsense." But the judge raised his hand for silence. The room stilled again. "Why do you think you can heal me, child?" His tone was gentler now, curious despite himself. The girl's lip trembled slightly. "Because I can," she said simply. "I've done it before." She looked around at the faces staring back at her, at the sneers and smirks, and her eyes glistened. Not with fear, but with fierce conviction. "When my mother was sick, they said she would die, but I prayed over her, and she lived. I know I can help you too. Please, Your Honor, my father didn't steal anything. He's a good man. Just give me a chance." The judge's gaze softened, a flicker of humanity breaking through the layers of skepticism he wore like armor. But years of experience made him cautious. "Faith does not replace evidence," he said slowly, "and this court must deal in facts." The girl stepped closer to the bench, her bare feet slapping softly against the marble floor. "Then let me show you the truth," she said. "Let me touch your legs." A gasp rippled through the audience. The bailiff moved forward instinctively, but the judge motioned for him to stop. For a long moment, the room was frozen in silence, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone. The judge studied her face, too young to lie so fearlessly, too sincere to be scheming. Still, he hesitated. His condition was no secret. Doctors, priests, and charlatans alike had promised him healing in the years since his stroke, and all had failed. He had learned to live with disappointment. And yet, there was something in her voice, a strange echo of hope, that stirred the part of him that used to believe in miracles. "And if you fail?" he asked quietly. "If nothing happens?" The girl swallowed hard, then whispered, "Then you can keep my father, forever." A murmur spread through the crowd. The prosecutor looked uneasy now, unsure whether to laugh again or object. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the armrest, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded once. "Very well," he said. "Come forward." The laughter died immediately. The courtroom seemed to exhale all at once, as though the air itself had been holding its breath. The girl stepped up onto the wooden platform, her small figure dwarfed by the judge's towering seat. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out. The room was so quiet that everyone could hear the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet. Even the judge's usual composure slipped away, replaced by something raw and uncertain. She closed her eyes and placed her palms gently on his legs, her head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. The people watching exchanged glances, some mocking, some nervous. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The judge felt only the light pressure of her hands, warm against his cold skin. Then something strange began to stir deep within him, something he couldn't explain. A faint tingling sensation crawled down his spine, spreading into his legs, growing stronger with every heartbeat. His breathing quickened, his hand gripping the armrest as a sharp pulse of energy shot through him. The bailiff took a step forward, alarmed, but the judge held up his hand. The girl didn't move, her face serene, her fingers steady. The laughter was gone, now only stunned silence remained. People leaned forward, eyes wide, as if witnessing something that defied the natural order of things. The judge's lips parted, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" he murmured. His toes twitched beneath the blanket that covered his knees, a movement so slight it could have been imagined, yet the look on his face told everyone it was real. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The girl opened her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Do you believe me now?" she asked softly. The judge stared at her, words failing him. The courtroom, once filled with laughter and scorn, had turned into a cathedral of disbelief. The moment the laughter died in the courtroom, a strange tension took its place, heavy and electric, like a storm that had not yet broken. The girl still stood with her small hands pressed against the judge's lifeless legs, her eyes shut, whispering under her breath words no one could quite catch. The prosecutor, who had moments ago been smirking, now stood frozen mid-step, his voice caught somewhere between ridicule and awe. The bailiff's hand hovered near the judge's wheelchair, unsure whether to intervene or to simply witness whatever was happening. The faint light from the high-arched windows fell across the scene, catching in the dust motes that swirled lazily through the air, and in that golden haze, something began to shift. The judge's fingers clenched around the armrest of his chair. He could feel it, something faint, like the echo of a long-forgotten sensation. A warmth was spreading down his thighs. Not the dull ache of pain he had grown accustomed to, but something alive, pulsing, steady. His breath caught. For years, his legs had been nothing but cold weight, useless limbs bound to his body. Now, beneath the girl's trembling hands, they seemed to stir, as if remembering what it meant to belong to him. The courtroom watched in stunned silence, unable to believe their eyes. Whispers broke out among the spectators, people clutching at one another's sleeves, faces pale with disbelief. Some whispered that it was a trick, some that it was the devil's work, and others that perhaps God himself had chosen this moment to reveal his power through a poor man's daughter. The prosecutor, desperate to reclaim control of the room, cleared his throat sharply. "Enough," he said, though his voice wavered. "This is absurd. This court is not a circus. Stop this nonsense at once." The girl did not move. Her eyes opened slowly, and for a brief instant they seemed to glow with a strange, calm light. She looked up at the judge, her expression neither proud nor fearful, only certain. "I told you," she whispered. "I can heal you." The judge stared down at her, his face pale, eyes wide with a mix of confusion and wonder. His heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to speak, to deny what he was feeling, but the evidence was undeniable. Beneath the robe draped over his legs, his muscles were twitching, small movements, but movements nonetheless. The sensation of blood rushing through them was both exhilarating and terrifying. He gripped the edges of his chair as if afraid that if he let go, the moment would vanish like smoke. The girl stepped back, her hands falling to her sides, her breathing heavy from effort. The room was still. Then, slowly, almost painfully, the judge shifted forward in his seat. His feet brushed the floor. The sound of the soft soles scraping against the wood was so ordinary and yet so extraordinary that several people gasped aloud. His voice came out low, uncertain, almost a whisper. "I felt that." The prosecutor shook his head violently, as though trying to dispel an illusion. "It's coincidence," he snapped. "Reflex, that's all. The nerves twitched sometimes. It means nothing." But his words rang hollow, even to himself. The bailiff, who had served the judge for years, took an involuntary step backward, his eyes wide with astonishment. "Sir," he murmured, "you haven't moved like that since." His voice trailed off, too stunned to continue. The judge raised a trembling hand, motioning for silence. His gaze returned to the girl. "How?" he asked simply. She looked down at her feet, fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "I don't know," she said softly. "When people hurt, I just feel it, like their pain is mine. And when I ask for it to go away, sometimes it does." Her words were so plain, so innocent, that they sounded more truthful than any sermon. The judge's throat tightened. He had spent his life in the realm of logic and law, where evidence reigned supreme, and miracles were fairy tales told to comfort fools. But now logic offered him no explanation. The sensation was real, undeniable, and it was happening to him. His legs were waking up from a sleep he had thought eternal. The spectators began to murmur again, louder this time. Some fell to their knees, crossing themselves, whispering prayers. Others whispered accusations that the girl was possessed, that witchcraft was at play. The judge's face twisted, caught between the weight of his position and the chaos unraveling before him. He could not allow hysteria to rule his court. Yet how could he deny what was happening inside his own body? The prosecutor slammed his papers down on the desk. "This farce has gone on long enough," he barked. "The girl is clearly delusional, and you, sir, are in shock. The law cannot be swayed by illusions." His tone carried authority, but his hands were trembling as he spoke. The judge's voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. "Illusions do not move muscle, Mr. Grant." The prosecutor's mouth opened, then closed again, no retort forming. The girl looked up, hope shining in her tired eyes. "Does that mean you'll let my father go?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy and fragile. The judge looked down at his hands, then at the man in chains, beside Herhan, old farmer with hollow cheeks and calloused palms, whose eyes glistened with both fear and love for his daughter. He had sat silently through the entire scene, disbelief written across his face. He could not comprehend how his child, his little girl, who once cried over broken toys, could now stand before the highest seat of justice and perform what no doctor could. The judge's mind swirled. The law was clear. The man was guilty on paper. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Yet the law had never faced something like this, something that reached beyond reason, beyond the tangible. The girl's promise had not been empty. He could feel the proof coursing through his veins, and in that moment, a strange fear gripped him, not of her, but of himself. What if he had misjudged more than just her father? What if justice, the kind he believed in, had always been incomplete without faith, mercy, and mystery? The murmur in the room grew louder. People were standing now, whispering to one another, eyes darting between the girl and the judge. Some smiled through tears. Others watched with suspicion, as if expecting her to crumble under her own miracle. The girl's father bowed his head, his chains rattling softly. The judge looked at him for a long moment before turning back to the child. "Your father's case will be reviewed," he said at last, his voice thick. The prosecutor began to protest, but the judge cut him off with a single look. "The court will reassess." As the gavel struck the desk, the sharp sound rang like thunder. The girl let out a shaky breath, her shoulders trembling. The spectators erupted in hushed conversation as she turned to her father, eyes shining with relief and exhaustion. Behind them, the judge sat back in his chair, his legs still tingling, his mind spinning with questions no law book could answer. For the first time in years, he did not feel bound by his chair. He did not feel helpless. He felt alive, and though he said nothing, his eyes followed the girl as she left the courtroom. That small figure wrapped in something greater than understanding, something that neither science nor reason could define, but that had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about power, truth, and grace. There was no noise in the courtroom when the judge finally rose from his chair. The sound of his gavel still echoed faintly in the air, but all attention was fixed on the impossible, his trembling body rising to its feet for the first time in years. The poor girl, who only moments before had been the subject of mockery, stood frozen near the bench, her small face tilted upward in astonishment. The crowd held its breath. No one dared move, not even the prosecutor, who had been reduced to silence, his earlier arrogance swallowed by disbelief. The judge's hand gripped the side of his wheelchair as his knees straightened with visible effort. His robe swayed slightly as he steadied himself, the color draining from his face as if every ounce of strength was being drawn into that moment. When his feet met the polished wooden floor, it was as though the world had shifted on its axis. People gasped. Some even cried out, crossing themselves or clutching at the person next to them. The girl's father, still in chains, stared with wide, tearful eyes, unable to process what he was seeing. The judge's voice, when it finally came, was hoarse, unsteady, but full of something unfamiliar. "I'm standing," he said, almost to himself, as if he needed to hear it to believe it. The words seemed to strike the air like lightning. The courtroom erupted in a chorus of whispers, disbelief, and awe. Some people fell to their knees. Others rushed forward, only to be stopped by the bailiff, who was trembling just as much as they were. The judge took a hesitant step forward, then another, his legs trembling but obeying. Each movement was a miracle unfolding in real time. Every shuffle of his feet, every shift of his weight was a defiance of the years of paralysis that had chained him to the chair. The sound of his footsteps, soft, uneven, and yet so powerfully alive, filled the room with a sense of holy disbelief. The girl stood motionless, her eyes wide but calm, as though she had known this would happen all along. Her hands were clasped together, not in pride but in silent gratitude. The judge turned toward her, his face wet with tears that he didn't bother to hide. His voice trembled as he whispered, "How did you do this?" But she only shook her head slightly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't," she said. "I just asked." The simplicity of her answer struck him harder than any explanation could have. The crowd murmured again, this time not with laughter or mockery, but with reverence. The air itself seemed charged with something divine, as though they had all stepped into a space that existed between faith and reality. The prosecutor, pale and sweating, stumbled forward, his rational mind crumbling under the weight of what he was witnessing. This cannot be real," he stammered. "There must be an explanation. A trick? A coincidence?" But his voice broke before he could finish. No explanation would suffice. The judge, who had once been the embodiment of law and logic, felt both stripped and renewed. He looked down at his hands, at the faint tremor in his fingers, and realized that what had happened defied every rule he had ever sworn by. The chains that bound him to reason had shattered. He looked at the girl again, and for the first time in his long career, he felt truly humbled before another human being. The murmuring grew louder as the crowd tried to make sense of the impossible. Some cried out that it was a miracle. Others whispered about witchcraft or divine retribution. The air was thick with emotion, fear, awe, joy, and disbelief, all blending together into a single, overwhelming wave. The girl took a small step backward, her body trembling now, exhaustion settling into her limbs. Whatever force had worked through her seemed to have drained her completely. Her father, still bound, struggled to rise, his voice breaking as he cried her name. The judge motioned for the bailiff, who hesitated before stepping forward. "Release him," the judge said softly, his tone calm but unyielding. The bailiff froze, glancing at the prosecutor, who stood speechless. "But, Your Honor, release him," the judge repeated, louder this time, and his voice carried the same authority it once had from his chair, only now magnified by something greater, something that came not from power, but from revelation. The metallic click of the manacles unlocking echoed like a benediction. The girl's father fell to his knees, wrapping his arms around his daughter, his sobs filling the silent hall. The judge watched them with eyes that had seen countless trials, countless lies, countless punishments, but never truth as pure and undeniable as this. The world outside those walls no longer mattered. The law, for that moment, bowed to something higher. The judge turned to the crowd, his expression solemn yet illuminated with a strange serenity. "You all saw," he said quietly. "You laughed, as did I, at what you could not comprehend. But the truth stands before you. The law can bind men, but it cannot bind what moves beyond it." His words rippled through the courtroom, settling into the hearts of all who heard them. Even those who had doubted, who had mocked the girl's plea, now found themselves shaken to the core. The prosecutor stood silent, head bowed, his face pale. The girl looked up from her father's embrace, her eyes meeting the judge's one last time. "Thank you," she whispered. "You kept your promise." He shook his head slowly, his lips curling into a faint, weary smile. "No," he said softly. "You kept yours." She smiled faintly, but there was sadness in her eyes too, as if she understood that this moment would change more than just their lives, it would haunt them all. The judge took another step forward, testing his newfound strength, feeling the strange lightness of freedom in every movement. The crowd parted instinctively as he descended from the bench, each footstep echoing through the vast chamber like the toll of a bell. He approached the girl and her father, placing a trembling hand on her head. "You came here asking for justice," he said, "and you gave me mercy." She looked up at him, tears streaking her face, but she said nothing. There were no words left that could match the enormity of what had transpired. Outside, through the tall windows, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, flooding the room with golden light. It illuminated the judge's face, the girl's small figure, and the crowd that stood as witnesses to a miracle that would be spoken of for generations. But in that moment, there was only silence. The kind that feels sacred, the kind that follows something greater than understanding, something that humbles the proud and lifts the broken. The judge lowered his head, his eyes closed, as if in prayer. The world, for one fleeting instant, felt weightless, suspended between law and grace, between what was possible and what was meant to be.